Hello everyone, welcome to Global Compliance Panel live webinar on statistical concepts of process validation. My name is Ron and I'm going to be a host for today's session. On behalf of the Global Compliance Panel team, I'd like to thank you all for being part of this event. Today's webinar will be presented by Dan O'Leary. A few words about Dan before we could start off today's session. He's the president of Ombu Enterprises LLC, a company offering training and execution in operational excellence focused on analytics skills and a systems approach to operations management. Dan has more than 30 years experience in quality, operations, and program management in regulated industries including aviation, defense, medical devices, and clinical labs. He has a master's degree in mathematics, is an ASQ certified biomedical auditor, quality auditor, quality engineer, reliability engineer, and Six Sigma black belt. And he is certified by APICS in resource management. We are honored to have such a distinguished person such as Dan with us to present today's webinar. Now, before we begin, I would like to inform you of the program outline for this training session. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this webinar is for 75 minutes duration. Now, first, Dan will take you through today's webinar, highlighting the areas that would be covered, and he would then share with you his presentation. And I would also like to inform all participants, one part of the teleconference have been placed on mute and would remain so until the Q&A begins towards the end of the webinar. And I also request all participants to hold back your questions until the Q&A window begins. 10 minutes of your time will be allotted for the Q&A, during which your questions will be answered. Now, if for any reason you get logged out of this training session or teleconference, please follow the same procedure to join in again. And now that we're all ready to start, I request Dan to take it from here. Dan?
Well, thank you very much, and welcome everybody to our webinar on statistical concepts of process validation. Now, as we go through the slides, what you'll see is on the bottom of each slide there'll be a slide number. So if you have a question about a particular slide, note down the number, and that will give us context. And during the Q&A session, I can go back to that particular slide and address it. Now, here's an outline of what we're going to talk about in this webinar today. First, we're going to look at the quality management systems, because this is where the requirements come from. And there are two, because we're talking about medical devices, that are of interest to us. The FDA's quality system regulation, which is required for medical device manufacturers who market in the United States, and ISO 13485. Now, it's the 2003 version. That is the international standard, and it's essentially required for people that market their devices in the rest of the world, such as Canada or the European Union. So we'll talk about the requirements there. Then we're going to turn our attention to the statistical process model. Now, I'll say up front, we're going to give you an outline of how statistics applies, but we could easily spend a full day on the statistical techniques involved. So we're going to give you the set of concepts about what's going on with the statistical applications in order to do process validation. So we're going to look at this statistical process model. Then we're going to look at the output from our process. And this is going to be very important because this is going to tie back into the quality management system requirements. There's a couple of issues here. One is sampling inspection. So we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at sampling inspection and give you an understanding about what's going on there and why that's an issue. And we'll also look at process capability, because process capability is going to be the fundamental thing by which we're going to demonstrate the requirements for our validated process. Then we're going to look at process input parameters. Now, in a validated process, we don't have the ability to check all of the output of the process. So the only way that we can control the process is through its input parameters. And so we're going to talk about the system that does all of that. And that's going to lead us into, again, two areas of statistics. One is design of experiments, and of course, this is not a design of experiments course. That could easily go on for a couple of days. And we're also going to talk about this concept of challenge points. So challenge points are going to be very important in understanding how the design of experiments are going to relate to the system. Then we're going to turn our attention to a related issue that's risk management. Now, medical device manufacturers typically do risk management through ISO 13485, but there are some risks associated with process validation, and so it's very important that they be accounted for in your risk management file. And so we're going to talk about how those items are related. We're going to do summary and conclusions, and then we'll open it up for questions. All right, so we're going to start with the quality management system. So the important thing here is that we have two systems that are commonly utilized in the world. For medical device manufacturers that sell into the United States, they have to follow the quality system regulation. Now, the requirement goes with where the devices are sold, not where they're made. So if you make a medical device in Europe and sell it in the United States, you have to implement the quality system regulation. On the other hand, we have ISO 9001 and 1345. 1345 is the version for medical devices, and that's required in other parts of the world. So again, it depends upon where you sell the device, not where you make it. So if you make a medical device in the United States and you sell it in Canada, then you have to have an ISO 1345 quality management system. Now, there's a couple of things that go on here in common, and what we'll find is that although they are worded differently, the requirements are essentially the same. So in the quality system regulation, we're interested in 820.75, which is process validation, and it's got a couple of definitions. It defines validation and process validation, so it's got a separate definition. And it tells us that when we meet certain conditions, we have to perform process validation. We're going to look at what those conditions are. Similarly, on the 1345 side, it's the requirements in clause 7.5.2. We've got a definition for validation, but we don't have a definition for process validation. And again, certain conditions are going to have to be met that will require us to perform process validation, and we'll talk about what those are as well. And they're going to essentially be the same in the two systems. Now, let's look at these definitions of validation. So in the quality system regulation, the definitions are actually in the regulation themselves. So what it tells us is that validation is confirmation of what? Well, of objective evidence that a particular requirement for a specified intended use can be consistently fulfilled. Now, there's a bunch of things going on here that are going to be important to us. Specific intended use, well, this is going to be the output of the manufacturing process, consistently fulfilled. Well, what we're looking for is that we can produce non-conforming material on a consistent basis. In other words, our process is going to work correctly. So that's going to lead us into validation. Now, in 1345 and ISO 9001, the definitions are not in the standard. They're in a different document. And so you have to have a copy of that document, and that's ISO 9000-2005. Now, this is not a mistake. There is actually a document called ISO 9000, and if you're not familiar with it, you need to get a copy because it's got all of the definitions. So if you've ever wondered what the technical definitions were for preventive action and corrective action, or repair and rework and so on, they're all in ISO 9000. And so you need to get a copy of it. Now, the definition here is confirmation through objective evidence that the requirements of a specified intended use or application have been fulfilled. And what we can see is, although these things are worded differently, in essence they mean the same thing. And we're going to find that that parallel structure throughout. Now, in FDA QSR, we have this definition of validation that we just looked at, but there's also an additional definition of process validation. And so process validation is a particular kind of validation, and it means establishing by objective evidence that a process, right, so we're going to be talking about processes, consistently produces a result or a product, and for our purposes, the output of a process is going to be a product that meets its predetermined specifications. Now, there's a couple of things going on here. Predetermined specifications implies that before we start making things, we know what the specifications are. We've determined them in advance. And they're going to come to the production floor from design, and they're going to come through the design transfer process. So the design transfer process is going to convert design output into production parameters, and that in essence is what we're talking about. So the predetermined specifications are going to start up in design control, move through design transfer to the production process. At the production process level, we're going to determine whether or not we are obligated to do process validation, and under the assumption that we are, then we're going to look at all of the stuff that we're going to look at here. Now, what conditions are required? Well, in QSR, it says when the results of a process cannot be fully verified by subsequent inspection and test, then the process has to be validated. Now, fully verified is not a defined term, and it causes a lot of grief about exactly what it means, and we'll show that in some of the warning letters that we're going to look at. Now, in 13485, it turns out that 13485 and ISO 9001, the wording is identical. So we'll just talk about 13485 because we're in the medical device context here. I need to validate any process for production and service provision where the resulting output, right, so the output of a process is a product, cannot be verified by subsequent monitoring and measurement. Now, notice these requirements here. They are worded differently, but they are parallel. The idea here is that I have a process, it produces a product, and I can't check everything that comes out of that process. In other words, I don't have the ability, or as we'll see in a moment, I choose not to check everything that comes out of the process, and that's going to trigger us to do process validation. Now, let's look at the requirements in QSR explicitly. FDA QSR divides process validation up into 3 phases, and this is going to be a very important model for us here. So the first phase is how do we determine what processes to validate, and how do we actually perform the validation? So this is an A20.75A, and we'll look at it in detail in a moment. The second piece is now that we've got the process validated, how do we actually run it? Right? So the issues involving running of the process, monitoring the process inputs. And then the third phase is when we have to revalidate. So there are a set of conditions, and if we meet those conditions, then we have got to do something about revalidation of the process and leave some records behind. So we'll look at what's going on there as well. Now, here are the explicit requirements. And so what it tells us here, as we looked at earlier, when the results of a process cannot be fully verified by subsequent inspection and test. So that's a very important phrase. That defines when we have to do process validation. The process shall be validated with a high degree of assurance. That tells us what the end result looks like. So we're going to have to do validation, and we're going to have to achieve a high degree of assurance. I'm going to tell you what that means here in a moment. And then it's going to be approved according to established procedures. So I've got a set of procedures that tell me how to perform the validation. Now, what does this mean? Cannot be fully verified by subsequent inspection and test. For now, take it to mean that we do not fully verify by subsequent inspection and test. In other words, we could have a situation where it is possible to verify, but we choose not to. We choose to use a sampling plan. And so we're going to look at what that sampling plan means. Now, the second thing we're going to look at is validated with a high degree of assurance. High degree of assurance means that we're not going to produce non-conforming material. In other words, the process only makes what I'm going to call good stuff. So what does this mean in a technical statistical term? Well, it means we have a capable process. And so what it really means, it doesn't write it this way, but what it really means in the modern language is that we have a process capability index, a CPK, that's at least 1.33. That's going to be the minimum acceptable, and we'll look at what all of that means. We'll look at the calculations, and we'll look at some pictures that illustrate the issue as we go into the presentation. Now, when FDA QSR came out, it was issued as a draft, and people commented on the draft. And then FDA collected all of the comments and reacted to them, and they explained their thinking in a document called the preamble. And the preamble is really valuable because it helps you understand a lot about what the thinking was. And so we're going to look at a couple of things from the preamble here. So Section 143 says this phrase, special process. Now, this is what process validation was called many, many years ago, particularly in the military requirements. It was called a special process. And FDA used it, but they didn't define the term. So instead, what they said is, we're going to drop it, and we're going to call it process validation, and we are going to define the term. And they give some examples. So what they're saying here is that when a process cannot be fully verified by subsequent inspection and test. In other words, you can't check everything that comes out of the process. Then you have to validate with a high degree of assurance, and they give some examples. Sterilization, aseptic processing, injection molding, welding, and so on. The validation method, the preamble tells us, has to ensure that predetermined specifications are consistently met. So we know what the specifications are. We've got a process that consistently meets those specifications. That's the concept of process capability. And so that's what we're going to look at. Now, we now turn our attention to the B part. This is when we run the process. So you have to establish procedures for monitoring and control of process parameters. These are the inputs to the process. Because remember, we cannot check the output of the process, so our only hope is to control the inputs to make sure that the output is correct. Right? So we're going to monitor and control these process parameters for validated process to make sure that our specified requirements continue to be met. So in other words, we're going to know the acceptable range of the input process parameters, and we're going to control and monitor them so they stay inside the acceptable range, and as a result, voila, we only get good stuff out of our process. So what does this mean? The process parameters are the inputs. And if they stay inside this acceptable range, we're going to get good stuff. And what this means is design of experiments. And this is where we're going to look at some of the underlying statistical ideas. So we're going to explore this parameter space using design of experiments, and then we're going to challenge the parameter space as we've explored it for some worst-case conditions, and we'll see what's going on there. Now, the B part says you have to establish and maintain procedures to make sure that these things are continue to be met, and the preamble gives us a little bit about what's going on here. A 20.75b, the preamble tells us, applies to performance of the process after validation. 75a is the initial validation of the process. So that's what we talked about as the phases. In the very last paragraph here, it tells us that the interval and frequency shall be periodically evaluated for adequacy and revalidated following 87C. So what this means is we've got to monitor the input parameters, and so we have to establish the interval and frequency for monitoring, and so that's going to be part of our procedures. And initially, the FDA said that they had to be continuously monitored, and comments pointed out that you can't always do that. Maybe you don't have a data logger. Maybe you just check the input parameters every so often and you record what they are, and as long as they stay in control, you're fine. So what the issue here is going to be is that we're going to monitor the input parameters at some predetermined interval and frequency, and that is going to give us enough information to know that the input parameters stay inside the acceptable range. Now, 820.75c talks about changes or process deviations. And process deviations are one of the issues that we want to talk about. The process input parameters could go outside the acceptable limits. In other words, the parameters are going to change over time, natural variability of the process. And if they go outside the acceptable limits, then we don't know that we've got a process operating with a high degree of assurance. So why did that happen? What went wrong that allowed that to happen? So that would be a process deviation. A verification check reveals a problem. Maybe we're doing a sampling plan at the end, and lo and behold, we have non-conforming material in the sample. That gives us a problem. Or maybe what happens is we don't discover it, and it ships. It comes back to us as a complaint, and the complaint investigation leads us back to a validated process. So here's a couple of ways in which we could have this problem. Now, what's going to happen is we'll see in the end a strong connection to the ISO 14971 risk management program. Oftentimes, processes are used on the manufacturing floor to control things that could present risk to users and patients if things were not under control. And so very often what we'll see is production and is defined as one of the things we want to monitor in the risk management plan, and post-production, in other words, complaint investigations, for example, may also lead us back into validated processes. So those are going to be the important things that we're going to look at. Now, we're into the C part. When changes or process deviations occur, I've got to review and evaluate the process and perform revalidation where appropriate. Now, the preamble tells us that this is the requirements for process validation, and I do not have to revalidate processes just because they show up on a calendar. In other words, I don't have to have a master revalidation schedule. I revalidate processes when I have a change to the process or a process deviation occurs. And one of the things I need to look at, according to the preamble, is the interval and frequency for monitoring the process parameters. So I need to look at those, make sure that they're still satisfying my requirements. And so that's one of the things that I might want to look at if I have a process change or a process deviation. Does that make me want to change my interval and frequency for monitoring the process input parameters? Now, what we have here is the overview of how all of this fits together. So we're going to establish product requirements. In other words, the output of a process is a product. So what do we need from that product, right? And as I said, oftentimes that's going to start up in design and move down into production through design transfer. We're going to determine our verification methods. So once we produce the product in the process, how do we verify it? This is often called acceptance activities in 820.80. The question we're going to ask is the output fully verified? Then we're going to validate the process if we need to. In other words, the output is not fully verified. So we're going to validate the process to give us a high level of assurance. Then we're going to operate the process by monitoring the input parameters. And if we see any process deviations or if we make any changes to the process, then we're going to decide whether or not we're going to revalidate. And, of course, because this is a quality management system, we're going to leave records behind of all of the stuff that we do. All right, so now we're going to turn our attention to 13485. This is parallel, and so the requirement here is that I have to validate any process for production and service provision, and that's the term in 1345, where the resulting output cannot be verified by subsequent monitoring and measurement. So, in other words, when I can't check the output of the process through monitoring and measurement, in QSR we called it inspection and test, then I have to validate the process. And they've got this additional thing that reminds us that it may very well be that we don't detect the deficiency until after the product has been delivered. So it may very well be that it doesn't show up until the customer starts using it. And so that's one of the reasons that would want us to validate the process to make sure that those kinds of problems don't get created, and so therefore we're not leaving them for the customer to find. Now, as I said, subsequent monitoring and measurement and fully verified by subsequent inspection and test, to me, they are the same thing. They're worded differently in the two standards, but they are classic. Now, sorry, they are equivalent. Now, the classic case of stuff that shows up in use is a paint system. So I might have a paint system, and the paint system looks wonderful when I do the paint, but maybe what I have is a long-term adhesion problem, and so it doesn't show up as a problem until after the product gets into service. And so I can't find it until after it's shipped in the customer's hands because the problem hasn't occurred yet. So that's the kind of thing that we're looking for. Now, validation demonstrates the ability of these processes to achieve planned results. So remember, we've got to validate with a high degree of assurance in QSR, but the idea here is that I know what the results are that are supposed to come out of the process, and so that basically means the same thing as a high degree of assurance. So 1345 and QSR are equivalent. Now, what this means is that although the wording is different and I might have to say things differently in the two systems, they're not contradictory. And they are complementary. So if I put everything in place, for example, to satisfy QSR, then I will satisfy everything in 1345. The only thing that's different is that 1345 doesn't have this requirement about revalidation and process changes and so on explicitly. It's implicit in 1345. It's explicit in QSR. So in that sense, QSR states a few more things. So if you're only going to pick one, make sure you satisfy everything in QSR, and you'll get all of the 1345 stuff automatically. Now, what's going on with this statistical process model? Now, the good document to look at. Now, FDA for medical devices does not have a process validation guidance document. They've got one on the drugs and biologics side, but they don't have one on the devices side. So everybody, including FDA, uses this Global Harmonization Task Force guidance document. And FDA investigators are trained on this guidance document. So it's well worth your while to get a copy and make sure that you understand it. It's a really good guidance document. It's got a lot of explanations about what's going on, how to set up the system, and so on. Now, it was written by the Global Harmonization Task Force, which doesn't exist anymore. It's been replaced by the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, IMDRF. And I've given you the link here to the IMDRF website, and all the GHCF guidance documents are there. And this gives you the guidance document, its number, so it's easy to find. And what's really valuable here is there are also two annexes. One is a set of statistical methods and tools. So this is an explanation of methods and tools that you can use in order to do your process validation. And Annex B has a worked example. So they go through the process of validating, they go through a worked example of validating a process and demonstrating how this all works. So this is a really good guidance document. And you should make sure that you have a copy of it, go through it all, understand it, and if you follow it, you'll be in pretty good shape. And remember, FDA investigators are trained on it, so it forms the basis of their expectations as well. Okay, so let's look at this process model. This is a model that it sort of looks like Six Sigma model, which should be no surprise. And basically what it says is that I have a bunch of input parameters. They go into some process. The process produces an output, this big Y. And the idea here, and this was the fundamental idea in Six Sigma, is that I can model the process using statistical methods. And so that's what this equation in the teal-colored box says. So I'm going to take the input parameters, I'm going to transform them in some way, and in theory I could write an equation that describes this transformation process and produce the output, the big Y. Now, the problem here in the validated process is I can't check the Y's. I cannot check everything that's coming out of that process. So the only thing that I can do is control the input parameters. So I need to understand what's going on with the input parameters and what effect they have. And that's going to be the essence of the statistical model. Now, how could I verify the output of this process? Well, there are, in theory, three methods: 100% inspection, sampling inspection, or no inspection. The paradigm case is often destructive testing, in which you have no hope with 100% inspection. If you have to destroy it in order to know whether or not it was made correctly, you're never going to have any product to ship. So that's one reason why we often get into sampling inspection. And oftentimes, depending upon what the process is, maybe there is no opportunity to inspect. It's a process that produces a very small number of highly expensive parts, and the only verification method is destructive. So maybe we don't do any inspection. We're going to rely upon the validated process in order to make sure that all of this thing works. So, so those are our typical verification methods. And the question then is, which cases require process validation? Well, as I said, fully verified is an undefined term. So I'll give you a couple of things that it could mean. I could inspect all the products for all of their characteristics. And oftentimes I find this is what FDA investigators take it to mean, that if I'm not looking at every dimension on the drawing for everything that comes out of the process, I'm not fully verifying. If I've got a complex part with a couple hundred dimensions, that's going to be a bit of a problem. So what oftentimes happens is we have critical to quality characteristics. There's a lot of features on a drawing that if they're slightly out of spec, they're not going to impact the way the part gets used and its ability to function in the medical device. A common characteristic, for example, might be color. If I don't have the paint color exactly right, the medical device is still going to perform its function. So maybe what I have are critical to quality characteristics, and so I'm going to inspect all of the products for the CQTs, not for all of the characteristics. Sampling is going to follow the same way. I'm going to sample some products. I could look at all of the characteristics on the items in the sample. I could just do the critical to quality characteristics. And no inspection means I'm not going to inspect anything. Now, oftentimes what we find is that if you're not doing 100% inspection, FDA investigators and notified bodies for ISO 1345 will expect you to do process validation. So if you're doing sampling or if you're not doing any inspection, then you should be validating your process. And you got to sort out this issue about where you're inspecting all of the products for some critical to quality characteristics. So you need to get an understanding there. Now, we're going to look at a warning letter. Now, the warning letters are issued by the FDA to companies for which the FDA investigator comes in and does an inspection. They find a problem, and the problem is significant. And so when they initially find the problem, they write up something called a 483. And if the problem is significant, then it goes on to a document called a warning letter. And the warning letters are all public information. You can download them from the FDA website. And this one is particularly interesting because it's going to illustrate the issues that we just talked about. So the problem here is failure to validate a process following 75A. For example, the FDA says you've not validated the following things, right? So ultrasonic cleaning, tumbling, cleaning, passivation, and so on and so on. So there's a bunch of things that FDA said should have been validated, and they've given some examples in the warning letter. Now, oftentimes companies and the companies always should, but they don't always, respond to the 483 with a plan about how they're going to fix it. You're not required to respond to the 483, but oftentimes it's going to give you a lot of value in order to go back to the FDA and say, we understand the issues and we're taking them seriously, and here's our plan. Now, apparently that happened because the FDA comes back with the warning letter and says, we've reviewed your response, which lists several other manufacturing processes that you state don't need validation. In other words, the company here is, in essence, challenging the FDA's finding and going on further and saying, not only are you wrong there, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff that doesn't require validation either. And FDA comes back and says, we've concluded your response is inadequate because you are not testing every device to assure it meets its specifications, and the results are not fully verified. Now, this is the warning letter that often triggers a lot of FDA thinking about what fully verified means. So what it says here for sure is that you're not testing every device to make sure it meets its specifications. So FDA concludes all of these processes must be validated to make sure the specifications are consistently met, or you must test all devices. So this is the way FDA interprets this. If you are not doing 100% inspection or test on everything that comes out of the process, then you must validate the process. And that's going to lead us into sampling plans, because that's very often what happens. And the concern the FDA has is that if there are items in the sample, if there are items in the lot that did not get into the sample, they've not been inspected or tested, you don't know whether or not they're conforming, you could ship non-conforming medical devices as a result. So you need some other level of assurance other than the sampling plan to cover the stuff that's not in the sample. That's what the issue is. So that's going to lead us into sampling inspection. Now, in attribute sampling, you decide to combine a validated process with attribute sampling. This is very common. So maybe in theory you could look at everything that comes out of the process, but if it's a high-speed process or a high-volume process, you're not going to be able to do that. You want to do sampling to just as a sanity check to make sure the process is operating correctly. So we're going to look at attribute sampling plans. There's a variety of sampling plans, attribute plans and variables plans. That would take us too far afield to get into all of these issues of sampling plans, so we're just going to look at attribute plans in the interest of time. Now, almost certainly you're going to implement a sampling plan using an acknowledged standard or some other document. And the very common ones in the United States, it's ANSI ASQ Z1.4. Outside the United States, it tends to be the ISO standards, so ISO 2859-1. They are equivalent. They, in essence, mean the same thing. And then there is a document published by the American Society for Quality called Zero Acceptance Number Sampling Plans. People often use that in place of Z1.4 or ISO 2859. We're not going to get into the advantages and disadvantages of doing those things, but the two standards, Z1.4 and 2859, are recognized consensus standards by CDRH. So they're fair game, and I've never heard of any FDA person objecting to using the C=0 zero acceptance number sampling plans. Now, when you do sampling plans, however, there are some requirements in QSR. And here it is. So they've got to be written and based upon a valid statistical rationale. You have to have methods to make sure that they're adequate for their intended use, and that when changes occur, the sampling plans are reviewed. So this is very important. What's going to happen in validated processes is that if you make a process change or you have a deviation, you have to go back and validate or at least decide whether or not you need to revalidate your processes, and you should be looking at the frequency at which you are looking at input parameters. In addition, if you have a sampling plan, you should be looking at whether or not the sampling plan is giving you the level of protection that you need. And we're going to talk about that when we talk about the operating characteristic curves. It's going to give you some understanding of the level of protection that you get. In other words, the risk that you're taking by doing sampling. So it's described by something called an operating characteristic curve, and this is a picture of what they look like. Now, if you get the standards we just talked about, Z1.4, the C=0 sampling plans, in the back, they've got copies of the operating characteristic curves. You should look at them because they are telling you what's going on. And so with an AQL sampling plan, in essence what's going to happen is that if your process is operating at or below the AQL, well, it doesn't make any difference. Regardless of where your process is operating, you're going to have some probability of accepting lots that are coming out of that process. That's what the operating characteristic curve does. It gives you a picture of those probabilities. And so that's what this curve looks like. And there's a couple of points that we're interested in. The AQL is often used as the index for these things, and without getting too fine a point on it, it's typically the point where we've got about 95% probability of accepting lots coming from that process. The RQL point has got a couple of other names. It's sometimes called limiting quality, LQL, or lot tolerance percent defective, and it's usually 10% probability of accepting lots coming out of that process. So the operating characteristic curve is going to be very important, and we're actually going to see it should start to show up in a warning letter. Failure to establish and maintain procedures for sampling plans, so that's what this warning letter is about. There's no procedures to ensure that sampling plans are reviewed when changes occur, right? So one of the things that you should be doing is every time you make a change and there's a sampling plan involved, you need to ask the question, does the change impact the sampling plan that I'm using? And you should leave a record behind that you did that evaluation. Now, here's a case where I disagree with the warning letter. There's no procedure to explain or describe when to increase or decrease the acceptable quality limit when the acceptance or failure rates change. That's not the way these sampling plans work. What's really going on in Z1.4 and the C=0 is there's something called the switching rules. So you don't change the AQL, but when failures occur, you switch to a different set of plans that are all based upon the same index value of AQL. So there's a little technical issue with this warning letter, but the idea is correct, is that you need to have systems in place that allow these plans to change when changes are made and allow the plans to adjust themselves dynamically. That's what the switching rules do. When you are seeing changes in the processes. So this is very important. Now, here's another sampling plan. The sampling plans that they used are redacted, and that's what these little B4s mean. And so based upon what's going on here, I think this warning letter was originally referring to Mill Standard 105, which is the precursor of Z1.4. Mill Standard 105 has been obsolete for 30 years, and nobody should be making references to it anymore. You should be using Z1.4 instead. Now, what they're saying here is that this company is naming the AQL point, and they're not looking at what's called the lot tolerance percent defective, which on my OC curve I call the RQL point. They mean the same thing. What they're saying here is without specifying the 2 points on the curve for the sampling plan, it does not establish the process is validated with a high degree of assurance. Now, when you use the sampling plans out of the standard, which almost everybody does, instead of trying to develop their own, those values are all shown on the OC curves in the back of the book, and they're also tabulated as well. So those very specific values are there. So if you're using Z1.4, you can answer this question explicitly, but if you ever get one of these very picky FDA investigators, you need to know where to look up the AQL value and the RQL or LTPD value in the sampling plans. Okay, now let's turn our attention to validated with a high degree of assurance. So what does this really mean? Well, our issue here is that the process should only produce conforming product. That we'd like to know that, and for every process that we make. But if the process produces non-conforming product, then we could verify the output with subsequent inspection and test. And so that turns out to be the issue, because with a validated process, we can't do that. Right? So we want to know that our process consistently achieves a high level of performance without having the ability to check everything that comes out of the process. In other words, we want the process to operate correctly, and so that's going to lead us into this business of process capability. Now, here's what's going on. This is a process that's unstable, and so what you can see is that this process is changing over time. So if we look at it at one time, we're here, and the next time we look at it, the process is shifted, so it's over here. Another time, it might be over here. The end result is that this process is changing over time. That's very unstable, and our customer, the organization that consumes the output of this process, sees this huge variation, right? Because they're seeing, in essence, the cumulative effect of all of this instability in the total variation that they see coming out of the process. Now, what happens if we can fix that? Right? In other words, we go from an unstable to a stable process. Now, notice what's happening. There's still a little bit of change here. The process is not at the same point here as it is when we take another snapshot in time. And here it's shifted again, but the variation is quite small. And so the process is not changing a lot like it was in the previous slide, and so that's a stable process. And that's what we desire, but it's not enough. What we really want is a capable process. So here we have a process that is stable. It's not changing over time, but it's not capable. Notice what's happening. As this process operates, it's producing stuff outside the spec limits. Right? It's producing stuff outside the spec limits. We don't want that. That's non-conforming material. We don't want our processes to do that. So what we really want is a process that is capable. And so here's a process that stays inside the lines. Right? This is a process that is capable. It stays well inside the specification limits, and in order to do that, it also has to be stable. So a stable process that produces stuff inside the spec limits is going to be called capable, and that's where we're headed. So we need to measure it, and there's a couple of common measurements. There's a variety of things that we could talk about in process capability, but we're going to look at two very simple ones. CP and CPK. One of them involves comparing the process width to the specification width without understanding necessarily where the process is centered inside the specification width. CPK considers process centering. So here's how they're calculated. I have in the CPK calculation upper spec limit minus lower spec limit. In other words, that's the width of the specifications. And then I have the natural process variability, which is measured by standard deviation of the process. And I'm going to estimate it somehow. And that estimate, the processes are normally considered to be 6 standard deviations wide. That's typically going to take up 100% of the process output. And so I'm going to compare those two widths. How wide is the specification divided by how wide is the process measured through its variability, and that's going to give me a number. That's CP. Now, a more common one, or I shouldn't say a more common one, but a more refined version says, well, I could have the process output be relatively narrow compared to the specifications, but I'm over on one side of the specification limit, so I could still be making non-conforming material. So I want to answer the question, where am I relative to the center of the process? And that's called the process mean. And it's this Greek letter mu. which is right here. That's the process mean. And so what I'm going to do is ask the question, measured in terms of process variability, standard deviations, how far is it from the upper spec limit to the process mean, measured in terms of standard deviations. And then I'm going to ask the second question, how far is it from the process mean to the lower specification limit? And I'm going to take the smaller of those two. All right, so I'm going to get two numbers, and I'm going to take the minimum value of those two numbers. So that's going to be my CPK. So in essence, it's going to take into account centering. It's going to tell me where the middle of the process is relative to the specification limits. So, so these are very valuable. Now, I'm going to do a capability study in order to determine whether or not my process is capable. I'm going to compare them with the design specifications, and so I know the upper and lower spec limits. I know the process variability. I can do the math that I just showed you, and I can calculate CP and CPK. And the rule of thumb is that CPK should be 1.33 or better. And I'm going to show you some pictures about what this means. But what this basically tells us is that the process output fits nicely inside the specifications with a little bit of room to spare. So here's our first set of pictures. So here are CPKs. These are some graphical examples, and I've assumed here that the process is centered. And notice what's going on in the upper left-hand picture. CPK is 0.75. It's less than 1, and lo and behold, I've got some non-conforming material. Now, if I make the CPK exactly 1, what that says is that the spec limit and the natural process variability are exactly the same. And so the process fits nicely and exactly inside the spec limits, and in essence, I don't get any non-conforming material. Now, what happens if I make the process variability go down? Well, this is the desired state that I just talked about, CPK at 1.33, and what this says is that my process fits inside the spec limits, and I've got a little bit of room to spare. And if I can get even better, I can get up to a CPK of 2.0, and I've got gobs of room to spare. Right, so that's the desired state. So the minimum acceptable situation here is a CPK of 1.33 or better. And what happens if now I have some variability in the process and it shifts? Well, lo and behold, what happened with the poor process capability? Lots of non-conforming material. When I had an exact fit, I'm now making non-conforming material because I'm not centered. When I have a CPK of 1.33, still don't make non-conforming material because I have this room to spare. And when I've got a CPK of 2.0, I've got nothing to worry about. Minor process variability is not going to produce non-conforming material. So CPK at 1.33 is the minimum value that I'm interested in. So now we understand something about the outputs and how to measure them. Let's look at these input process parameters. So recall our model, only now we've changed it. Instead of just having a capital letter Y, what I'm really doing is looking at this process capability, CPK 1.33 or better. And so I've put the picture in place. But the question is, since I can't check the output, what input parameters are going to give me the desired output? In other words, what combination of input parameters is going to give me a CPK of 1.33 or better? That's the high degree of assurance criteria that I've set. So we're going to look at a very simple picture. Assume our process has got two input parameters, temperature and pressure. So the question is, what range of temperature and pressure provide an output with a CPK of 1.33 or better? And remember that these process parameters might interact with each other. So I might have to worry about parameter interactions. And so this is what I'm going to happen. I have a temperature range, and so I've drawn it right here. I have a pressure range, and I've drawn it right here. I've only got two parameters, so this is going to form a rectangle. And the idea here is that I'm going to operate the process at this nominal operating point, which is typically going to be right in the center of the rectangle. And what I want to do is ask the question, this is going to be the challenge points, what happens if I go up into one of these corners? So what happens if the process operates right up in here? What happens if the process operates right down in here? The idea is that I should be able to produce conforming material with an acceptable CPK at those corners. And those corners are going to be my worst case conditions. So the idea is that if I can produce acceptable material at the worst case conditions, then every other place inside the rectangle is the same as the worst case or better, right? Otherwise I wouldn't have the worst case. So if I can demonstrate that my process operates correctly at the challenge points, then I know it's going to operate correctly at all of the other points inside the rectangle. Now, I don't actually want to get to the outside of the rectangle, so what I really want to do is come back a little bit, and that's what I've shown here. So what I want to do is come back in a little bit, and I want to come back in a little bit, and so on up here, and so on down here. And as I monitor the process parameters, I'm going to establish these action limits. And I'm going to take action to readjust the input process parameters if I cross the dashed lines. And I'm going to do that often enough. I'm going to check them often enough that I'll find the problem before I go outside the solid lines. If I go outside the solid lines, I've got a deviation. So this is the idea of monitoring and controlling the process input parameters. I'm going to monitor them with a certain frequency, make sure they stay inside the box defined by the dashed lines. If they go outside the dashed lines, I'm going to readjust them to make sure that they don't go outside the solid lines. Right? So that's how I'm going to set up my monitoring parameters, frequencies and intervals. So that's what's going on. I'm going to run the challenge points, make sure that everything works correctly inside the solid box, and then I'm going to set everything so that I actually operate inside the dashed lines box. Now, GHCF guidance document talks about 3 phases of process validation: IQ, OQ, and PQ. And these are very common terms in the industry. IQ is going to tell us, did we get all of the equipment installed correctly? OQ is going to establish the process control limits and the action levels. And PQ is the sanity check that under anticipated conditions, we actually produce a product that meets its predetermined requirements. This is all defined in the GHCF guidance document. That's where these definitions come from, and so you really want to get the GHCF guidance document. Now, OQ is where we're really doing the work here. So it's going to establish the process control limits and the action limits. So the process control limits are the specification limits for the input parameters, right? These are not the specifications for the product. They're the specifications for the input parameters. They're defined by the solid lines in the box that I had on the previous slide. The action levels are where I'm going to take action and readjust these parameters if I cross the dashed lines, right? So the dashed lines are my action levels. The process control limits are the spec limits on the process parameters. Those were the solid lines. Now, the challenge points are these worst cases, and they're basically going to come at the corners of the parameter space. And so finding those corners is the application of design of experiments that we're going to talk about. So we want to consider this box defined by the process parameters. Now, if I only have 2 process parameters, like temperature and pressure in my example, then the box is going to be well defined. It's going to be a rectangle, typically, and it's easy to draw the picture. But oftentimes in processes, I have more than 2 process parameters. I might have 3, 4, 5, and 6. Once I get past 3, I can't draw the picture, but I do have, through design of experiments, a way to identify and explore what's going on in the corners. And the corners are the corners of a multi-dimensional box. So typically what I'm going to use is something called a factorial experimental design. We'll look at a picture in a moment. Full factorial experiments are going to look at all of the corners. Fractional factorial experiments are going to look at a specified subset. So here's the picture. If I have 3 input parameters, and each one of them could be at 2 levels, in other words, a high level and a low level, that's going to define the box. And it's just the next dimension up from what I saw with the rectangle. But in the rectangle, I had 4 corners. In this box, I have 3 factors. In other words, 3 things that could change. Maybe it's temperature, pressure, and some other characteristic. So now I've got a box with 8 corners. If I test everything in all 8 corners, then that's called a full factorial experiment. If I test only a distinguished set of corners, and I could test like half of them, then I only have to look at 4 corners. And through the statistical analysis that comes with design of experiments, I can learn something about the corners I haven't tested by analyzing the data from the data produced by the corners that I do test. Now, there's some issues going on. There's no free lunch, but the half fraction factorial experiment is only going to test half the corners. In other words, that's where the half comes from. The idea now is that every corner tested has acceptable results, CPK of 1.33. Those corners are going to be my challenge points. Those are going to be the worst case conditions. I'm going to find them through design of experiments. I'm going to test them as part of my OQ. And the claim then is that if I've got the worst case conditions, then anything inside this 3-dimensional box is going to be the worst case or better. And so things are going to operate satisfactorily anywhere inside the box as long as I can demonstrate they operate satisfactorily at the worst case corners. So this then is the next refinement of our process model. So we've got these input parameters, and I'm going to define this parameter space. Right? So I've got the limits on the process parameters. So I know the upper and lower values. If I'm back to temperature and pressure, I know the highest temperature allowed and the lowest temperature allowed. I know the highest pressure allowed and the lowest pressure allowed. I've defined those, and then I'm going to monitor them and control them so that I stay inside the solid box. But what's really going to happen is I'm going to monitor and control them so I stay inside the dashed line box that we looked at earlier. These corners are going to define the challenge points, and the claim is that if the process operates correctly at the challenge points, it's got to operate everywhere inside the box, because everywhere inside is no worse than the challenge points. Okay, so that's in essence what's going on here. So now we're going to turn our attention to risk management. Now, this is the flow of risk management from ISO 14971. And so we're going to do a lot of things along the way. So we're going to do some risk analysis. We're going to evaluate the results based upon some criteria that we've established for acceptability, and that's going to move us into risk control. And it's risk control that we're really going to talk about here, because it could very well be that one of the risks I see is associated with things that might be made incorrectly on the production floor. And that's going to lead me into the need for process validation. So the idea here is that if 1345 calls out 14971 as a way to do risk management, QSR doesn't. 14971 did not exist when QSR was written. So 1345 says, establish documented requirements for risk management throughout product realization, keep records, and recommends 14971 as the way to do it. 14971 is an FDA-recognized consensus standard, so they're very happy if you use it, and just about every medical device manufacturer in the world implements an ISO 14971 risk management system. So, so that's good. Now, there's a requirement in 14971 that I have to collect and evaluate production and post-production information. And it's production information that I'm interested in here, because if I have a validated process and it has a risk associated with the process output, then I want to control that risk through process validation on the production floor. And so the risk management plan is going to tell me what information I'm going to collect and how I'm going to collect it. And so the idea here is that if I am controlling risk that might result from a process that requires validation or for which I've chosen to do validation, then I need to be collecting and evaluating that information as part of risk management. The validated processes are often the high-risk processes on the manufacturing floor because they can't be fully verified. In other words, you're shipping stuff that, in theory, nobody's checked. Right? Maybe it's a destructive test, or maybe it's done with a sampling plan. So there are things that are going out the door that have never been verified, and for these characteristics that show up in your risk management plan. So it is very, very important that you have a validated process, and so your risk management plan should be collecting that information. You can often get it out of the DHR. You're supposed to be, the device history record. You're also supposed to be recording the results from the validated process. They go into the device history record. So you're not producing new records, but what you need to be doing is making sure that you're checking them. Now, what this means is that all of this stuff is going to go into the risk management file. You're going to update it periodically. So these are quality records that go into the risk management file. Think of it as a big filing cabinet. And you're going to do all of the initial stuff typically during design. After design transfer, you're going to get into the production and post-production information collection. And so the risk management file, at least that portion, is a living, breathing document. It's going to continue to grow and collect information based upon production and post-production information collection and evaluation. And so it all needs to be in the risk management file. So what I'm suggesting here is that you need to identify every process that could impact an identified hazard. For every combination of process and hazard, figure out what the limits are, record them in the risk management file. Every time you make a lot or a batch, record the actual input parameters. If you do any sampling plans, record the results of the sampling plans. Do all of this stuff, and it's going to end up in multiple places, right? It's going to end up in your device history record. It's going to end up in the risk management file. It's going to end up in a bunch of other places. So electronic pointers are often the easy way to make this happen, but make sure that these things connect and your validated processes become a significant portion of your medical device risk management file as well. Now, the other place that we're going to look at is post-production information and risk management, and oftentimes this is going to show up in the complaint system. So you're going to evaluate every complaint against the probability of occurrence and the severity of harm to see whether or not it matches what you did in the risk management file, and you're also going to do an evaluation in 820.100 in which you're going to analyze complaints using appropriate statistical techniques. When you investigate complaints, if it leads you back to the validated process, then you have a deviation. So all of this information is going to connect. So you need to make sure that you're looking at process parameters for validated processes and that you're looking at post-production information, primarily complaints, in terms of validated processes as well. Okay, so summary and conclusions. Regulatory requirements require validated processes. Validated processes, when we have sampling inspection, that's definitely need to do process validation. When the inspection is destructive, when we don't do 100% inspection, perhaps we could, but we choose not to, or we don't do any inspection at all of those processes have to be validated in QSR and 1345. This is applied statistics. So we're going to incorporate the verification methods into our model, and the verification methods should be capable of meeting a CPK of at least 1.33 or better. That gives us an acceptable process in that we've got a high degree of assurance that we're going to make conforming material. We're going to do that by controlling the input parameters. So they're going to be in the input parameter space. Don't forget that validated processes are often the high-risk processes in terms of what gets shipped to the customer because nobody's checking the output. So we want to make sure that we've got those things covered in risk management. So there's a linkage between risk management and process validation. So process validation, applied statistics, get the GHCF guidance document, read it, follow the IQ, OQ, PQ approach. There's a bunch of statistical methods in Appendix A. Those are going to be very valuable. High degree of assurance means a capable process when the input parameters are operating inside the defined input parameter space. So this is very important. All right, so now I'm going to turn it back to our host, who will open the presentation up for questions.
Thank you, Dan, for the wonderful presentation, and also the participants to cooperating with us. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned before, it's time for the Q&A to begin, and I request all who have questions for our presenter to click on the raise hand option, which is a palm-like icon at the bottom of your participants panel. Now, this option is used to ask your questions verbally, or you can also post your questions in the Q&A panel so that our presenter can read it out loud and then answer it for you. And I also want to let you know, for any reason you're unable to ask your questions using either of two means that I just mentioned, you can share your question with me through chat, and I shall pass it on to our presenter to answer that for you. Okay, Dan, I do have a question that's coming up from one of the participants. I'm just going to unmute that participant's line so that they can go ahead and ask the question directly to you, okay?
Okay.
Thank you. Kwan?
Hi, and so a lot of these issues we've been looking at seem to pertain mostly to production. How does this relate to new products or products within design?
Well, process validation is all about production, but the idea here is that as you're designing the process, the design function is going to make the product specifications, and then you have to follow the design transfer requirements, and the design transfer requirements are going to turn those product specifications into production processes. Right? So designs the product, design transfer sets the production processes and their production process parameters, and that's where you're going to then ask the question, how am I going to fully verify the output of this process, or how am I going to verify the output of this process? Is it fully verified? And if not, then as part of design transfer, typically that's where you're going to do the initial process validation. So even though it shows up in a different section, process validation is very, very often, almost certainly part of design transfer, and so design gets involved in getting it set up in order to make sure that you can actually make the medical device.
Okay.
Thank you, Dan. Kwan, I hope that answered your question. And Dan, I also have another question that's come up from one of the participants. I'm just going to pass the question to you through the chat messenger so that you can read out the question aloud and then answer it for the participants. Okay, there you go, Dan.
Okay, so the question is there a reference that you can provide that describes CPK 1.33 as an acceptable value? I think, I've been doing this for a long time, so I can't remember exactly where all the places are that this shows up, but I'm almost certain it's in the GHCF guidance document. There is a discussion about process capability indices. The convention in the industry is that if you're doing process capability indices, you want to make sure that your process fits inside the specifications. And so the rule of thumb, and there's a lot of quality control statistics books. Douglas Montgomery, for example, has got one that talk about what the acceptable values are of CPK. I don't know that it's in a standard anywhere, but I'm almost certain that it's in the GHCF guidance document. And any statistical quality control book that you find that discusses process capability with the CPK will almost certainly tell you 1.33 is the minimum acceptable value.
Thank you, Dan. And ladies and gentlemen, meanwhile, as we're waiting for the questions to come up, I sincerely request you to share your feedback in the feedback form that will just appear on your polling panel right now. Now, as you can see, the feedback has just 8 questions, mostly multiple choice in nature, and it wouldn't take more than 2 minutes of your time to answer this. Now, this polling would remain till the end of the session, so you can answer it even after the Q&A is over. And also like to inform all our participants, now if in case you do come up with any questions even after today's session ends, what you could do is you can go ahead and send your questions to me, and I can go ahead and send your questions to our presenter to answer that for you. Okay, and ladies and gentlemen, if any of you feel that your team members, colleagues, friends might benefit from this webinar, we are happy to inform you that this webinar will be available in the recorded format. You can purchase it from our website, or you can also call us at 800-447-9407. Ladies and gentlemen, if you do have any questions, you can put forward your questions to our presenter, and he can go ahead and answer it for you. Okay, and this is the upcoming webinar of Dan O'Leary, Outsourced Processes and ISO 9001-2008. Now, if you do need more information about this webinar, you can always log into our website and you can get more information about this. Okay, Dan, I do not see any questions that's coming up from our participants. Let's give it about a minute's time and see if there are any questions before we can go ahead and conclude the session for today, okay?
Okay, sounds good to me.
Thank you, Dan. Okay, Dan, I do not see any questions that's coming up from our participants. So even before we could conclude this session, do you have any other thoughts for the day?
The most important thing, I think, is to get the GHCF guidance document. Go through it. It's a really valuable resource. You can download it at no charge. And the important thing to remember is that this is an area in which FDA investigators are well versed. They've all studied the GHCF guidance document. They're going to come in and look for this stuff, and so make sure that you've got your processes validated.
Thank you, Dan, and we are all grateful to all of you having taken part in this webinar. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, as I mentioned, you can send us an email to webinars@globalcompliancepanel.com. And we look forward to having you with us again sometime soon. On behalf of our presenter, Dan O'Leary, and the Global Compliance Panel team, I'd like to say thank you all for participating in this webinar, and I wish you a pleasant day ahead. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and Dan, thank you so much for your time today, and you have a wonderful day ahead.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.